This is Professor Laird, and this is Chapter 1 of the Marriage and Family class. This is the meaning of marriage and family. What we'll talk about for this chapter is some basic terms and definitions, and then we will be delving into some of these topics a little bit further later on as we go through the course. So the Census Bureau defines family as two or more people residing together, related by birth, marriage, or adoption. Another very important term that is used throughout social sciences is the term household. That's an abbreviation HH that I will use quite often. This is all the people who occupy a particular housing unit. And then perhaps a more contemporary or inclusive definition of family in today's world, as we'll see quite a bit of alternative families and varieties out there in the world. This would be those related by birth, marriage, adoption, or choice. That is, an agreed upon relationship. Traditional family, over the years, sometimes referred to as the nuclear family. This consists of the married couple and their 2.1 unmarried children living together. Now, I'm being a little bit sarcastic about that 2.1, but that actually is the replacement ratio, which is the number of children that couples would need to have in order to sustain our population. And I'll be referring to that more times down the road in the course as far as the importance of the replacement ratio and the fact that last year the United States had a birth rate of 1.7. So we are below the replacement ratio, as is most industrialized societies. Either they already are or approaching that. We'll talk about that more later on. There's only about 1/3 of the U.S. family households that fit this particular nuclear family model. We also have what is called the extended family, in which the relatives, such as grandparents, aunts, or uncles, they live in the same home as the parents and their children. The family is the most important agent of socialization. If you've taken Intro to Sociology, you know there's approximately 7 major agents of socialization, and the family, a la the parents, is considered the most important because of how much influence it has on us very early on in our development stages. What does the family do for society? First of all, the family is the group that produces and socializes the children. The parents in particular, whether it's through inherited traits or the way that children are raised, parents are very important to influencing children's personalities, which stays with you most of your life, or perhaps even all of your life. Your values, your protection that's required for our long childhood. Humans have the longest childhood of any species on Earth, and that's so that our brains can grow and that we can learn, and the family provides that protection for us to mature as children. And then, of course, the inherited traits that we get from our parents as well. The family is the source of our intimate relationships. Those are the first ones that we develop. It develops these core bonds of loyalty that we then go out in the world and use those things that we've learned to develop other relationships and friendships, bonds. Family is also the primary unit of economic cooperation and consumption in our society. And also the family is important in assigning social statuses and roles. We grow up being children or brothers and sisters, and then we grow up to be parents, fathers and mothers. The definition of marriage, that's the socially and legally recognized union between two people in which they are united sexually, cooperate economically, may give birth to or adopt and rear children. Marriage, even in today's world, is still assumed to be permanent. We'll talk about divorce and separation, But marriage is considered a human universal, in that all cultures have developed some form of marriage without the benefit of communicating between cultures and saying, oh, this sounds like a good idea. Why don't y'all try this? Well, no, all cultures have developed that on their own. That's why it's called a human universal. In the United States, just over half of all the adults in the U.S. are married, referring to lots of figures in the textbook, which has got lots of data to refer to. Some of the stuff that I'll talk about is a little bit supplemental to the textbook, particularly if I go back further in history, or in some cases I may do a little bit more in-depth look at some things. But why does marriage exist? Well, humans have been evolving for about 6 million years, and almost exclusively that time we were evolving in small bands, anywhere from 20 to 50 humans of extended kin foragers. So therefore, evolved into humans into this family unit. So that's why it's so normal to us. Family is the central unit of human organization. Every culture, as I said, has created marriage to protect this family life, or in some cases, reinforcing a desirable relationship against the tendency of men to depart from it. That may be a little bit more of a cynical type view of it, but it's also compelled by human emotions of love and jealousy. So these are things that have all come together to create this concept of marriage. The first recorded marriage contract was about 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, one of the earliest human civilizations. The Roman Catholic Church elevated it to a holy union in the 5th century. By 1215, marriage was one of the 7 sacraments of the church. And then church decrees that they should be performed in public by a priest in the 16th century. So that you can see that's relatively recent in human history, that marriage has become a formal legal process. The functions of marriage are also similar to the purposes of the family in society, but there's also other things as far as provides established rights and obligations once you've committed into that situation, defines specific social roles of what the husband, what the wife, what the parents are tasked to do through the norms of society. It allows for the orderly transfer of wealth and property, whether it's from husband to surviving wife or to children. It also assigns responsibility of caring for and socializing the children. Also, other functions as well, as marriage is a pretty big topic for most any stand-up comic. We'll be talking about lots of trends in this class. It's not that I would ask students to memorize data, but we would still want to know what are the major trends, what has generally been decreasing over the past few decades, what has generally been increasing over the past few decades. Such as we can see here, the number of married households has been dropping steadily. Most of our turning points we'll look at as far as modern society or around the 1960s period. There was a lot happening in there that we'll talk about. We'll delve into some history in these first early chapters here. Let's see, the married households has been declining steadily, while the non-family households, those are the cohabitating couples, they have been steadily increasing, as well as other types of households have been increasing over that time. So those couple of general trends that have been fairly consistent over the past few decades. Some other terms that we would need to know: monogamy, that's where the individual has only one partner. In the case of marriage, obviously marrying only one person. In the modern world, since we do have a divorce rate that's probably around 45%, serial monogamy is another way to explain this, that we only have one partner at a time. Polygamy is where a person has several spouses at a time. This is not very common in the United States. It's actually illegal, but it is tolerated in a few areas. We'll touch on some of that a little bit more detail later. But polygamy, even over the worldwide, has declined steadily over the 20th century as states around the world develop and modernize. It becomes more of the norm. There's about 5 countries in Africa where about 20% of the men have polygamous marriages. And as far as women having more than one husband, that is extremely rare. There is a small group of people in the Himalayan Tibet region where women have typically married brothers of a family. They live on very mountainous, rugged terrain and try to farm along the terraced hillsides. So it's very, laborious type work. So it seems to be more practical for a family to have more than one husband working the land. So that's very rare. Kinship is a term, part of what bound humanity together for several million years while we were becoming human. It's a culturally learned process of who our kinfolk are, in addition to being biological. We have kin by blood and kin by marriage. It also provides continuity between generations and certain obligations in aiding people who are members of your family, are part of your kin. That varies from culture to culture. Patriarchy is where the male dominates the family. That is still somewhat of a norm in the United States. It's in most societies, it's the norm where the male dominates the family. That has been shifting, changing quite significantly. We'll get into some of those as well. Now, this patriarchy translates to society, because every society in the world is patriarchal, which means it's male-dominated society. We'll explain more on that. When we look at the strength of kinship, this is something that we are not only kind of inherited from as far as human traits go, as far as being bound to your kinship, but we're also socialized in certain obligations to our kin. This is a comment explaining the culture of corruption in Spain. Now, that doesn't mean all of Spain is corrupt, but higher levels of corruption in some countries than other. And one of the reasons that people have not yet embraced loyalty to the nation as an ethos. People are still more loyal to their family, to their clan, and then beyond that, to the tribe. We're very much a groupish species, and that's kind of inherent to us. Quote here, the social framework for our actions is always the gang, the group, the family. Also, the seeds of conflict are born in our kin. The most obvious human tragedy comes from the difference between our feelings toward our kin and our feelings toward non-kin. One of the deepest divisions in the world prevents us from putting more and more people into our moral circle of reciprocity, I guess you could say. Here are some of the trends over the past few decades, cultural changes. Now, most of what we talk about in this class will be focusing on the United States. We will see some cross-cultural, cross-country comparisons from time to time. But in general, we've been seeing a rise in cohabitation, people living together without being married, increase in never marrieds, even though they may intend to get married further on down the road, as well as an increase in formerly married, a la divorced. More dual earner households. There's also more single parent households. We've also seen the legalization of same-sex marriage just in the last few years, so the increase in same-sex marriages. So those are the general upward trends that we'll be hitting on from time to time during the class. There's also been an increasingly longer delay in marriage. Back in 1966 in the United States, men were less than 23 years old on average for their first marriage. women less than 21 years of age at the time of their first marriage. Now look at it now in the United States. For men, it's around 29. For women, and these numbers have been updated a little bit, women, it's at 27. So that's a pretty significant increase in this period of time as far as delaying marriage. Now, there's things that having to do with that. For example, more women going to college, more pursuit of trying to get more economic stability because we've had more economic volatility since that period. We'll get into descriptions and details later on. Here's some more charts and graphs. You can see as far as two parents in first marriage, quite a bit of decline there. In 1960, 73%, whereas just in the last 5 years or so, less than 50%. Down here on this side of the chart, one of the biggest increases is with single parents. As I've said, 9% of children were in single-parent households in 1960, 26% in the mid-2000 teens there. And these numbers, as they get updated, are still increasing. Now, they are in some cases showing to be kind of slowing down or leveling off. We'll get into some of that. Here's the never married adults, and there's a little bit of a growing gap there between men and women as well. But the main thing is that, yes, there is an increasing trend, most significantly since the 1960s, in those who have never been married at any given time. Again, that does not mean that they will never ever get married or they don't plan on getting married. It's just the number of people that are never married at that time has increased. And just a few years ago, we actually crossed the threshold in America where there's more people living in the United States who are not married as opposed to being married. And of course, that includes never marrieds and divorced and cohabitating altogether. So we've already crossed that threshold. Big however, even in the United States, there's strong norms as far as marriage, very strong institution. 80% of Americans over 25 have been married. It still tends to be the ultimate goal in a relationship to get married, the somewhat of the gold standard of a relationship. Endogamy, marrying within your own kind. This is typically within your own ethnic identity group for the most part. And then we've also got some similarities as far as age, range, and education, some of those characteristics. There's also a very strong norm in all societies, another human universal, of the incest taboo. There's a norm of marrying outside the nuclear family. 25 states actually prohibit marriage between first cousins. But one thing I always like to mention here is that, good news, guys, that means there's 25 states that do allow marriage between first cousins. Being a little sarcastic there, but I do think New Jersey and New York are two of those states that do allow it. So there's multiple perceptions and viewpoints of marriage and family, and we'll touch on these as we go. There is somewhat of a conservative liberal divide as far as the views of marriage, the importance of marriage, the sanctity of marriage, or the traditional values having to do with family and marriage. The religious mindset typically aligns with the conservative side of politics, and they, not surprisingly, hold more traditional views, because one of the practical definitions of conservative is that someone who's a little bit more resistant to change and is a little bit more preferable towards traditional values and the traditional norms of society that had been developing for a long time that kind of got us to where we are now. As far as the conservative liberal divide on the views of marriage, conservatives are less open to changing cultural values, as I said, generally more pessimistic about future effects on family, whether they're looking at these alternative lifestyles and changes in family norms that they may generally feel a little bit more pessimistic about. Liberals generally more open and optimistic about the future of family because we've got more choices, we've got more opportunities to create families of varied lifestyles. And the key words, of course, here are generally, because throughout a social science course, that's kind of what we deal with. We deal in correlations, in averages, generalities, tendencies. That's what we've got to be careful about. Whatever I'm explaining, describing in class does not mean that's what it means for you. It doesn't apply exactly to you. It applies to humans in general, or to Americans in general. As far as scientists that are studying the family, here's an example of some differing theories, and these are kind of at the heart of the course when we look at the impacts of divorce, separation, domestic violence, alternative families, step families, this wide variety of options in living in family relationships. Despite divorce, the vast majority of children develop into reasonably competent individuals. And it is the quality of the relationship between the divorced parents that has an important long-term impact. Another viewpoint, not necessarily contrasting, but just looking at a different aspect here, divorce increases the risk of interpersonal problems in children. So what's interesting as far as long-term studies goes, both of those comments are accurate for the most part as far as what we know from scientific studies. When a child is in a family that has conflict and the parents divorce, yes, there is a tendency for children of divorced families to have perhaps a little bit more effects on them long term from that, whether it's less stability in future relationships or less opportunities as a result of that divorce because they have fewer resources to deal with. But children of divorced parents, there's no guarantee that there's going to be any problems with it. It's just on the long-term outlook, there is a relatively small but measurable impact as far as the effects of divorce on children, because children aren't necessarily designed to deal with stress and conflict and separation anxiety. So there is a higher potential for that, but no guarantee that it would happen. So that is chapter 1 in our marriage and family class, talking about some general terms and definitions of the family and the marriage, as well as introducing some of the trends that we'll be looking at in more depth as we go through the class. So stay tuned for the discussion forum